Hey developers, today we are going to look at testing inside Vue.js. I'm going to explain how you guys can get started with it. I'm going to explain how you can use the wrapper and vue-test-utils, and we're going to go over some basic examples and then a couple of examples that are a little bit more difficult to set up, but we'll talk about it. But before we get too far, let's have a word from our sponsor. Hey guys, when you're building your own website, whether it's for yourself, your business, or a brand, one of the hardest things to do is to find that awesome domain name that is short, relevant, and shows the world what you're all about, which is exactly why I went and got vuecourse.tech, which goes so seamlessly with my brand. I'm currently using it as a really great website platform for my new Vue course, and it's absolutely perfect. Join the likes of Viacom, Intel, and CES and get your very own .tech at a whopping 90% off on 1, 5, and 10-year domains using the link go.tech/Erik. It'll be in the description below. Only this Black Friday. The sale starts on the 26th of November, so you can pre-register now and get a further 10% off on the same day sale. So make sure you go to go.tech/Erik in the link in the description below. Pre-register and you can get an additional 10% off. Thanks. Hey, and if you don't know, my name is Erik. I'm a full-stack software developer. I'm also a managing author. And I really like Vue.js. So, Vue.js is one of my favorite JavaScript frameworks out there. I also am a big fan of Angular and React as well. So let's begin here. This is our app that we created a few videos ago. It's just a real simple app where you can log in. You can even register, then log in, and then you have the secrets area. And I want to add a few tests to this. And we're going to add some basic tests. But first, if you are completely new to testing, a really good place to start with testing on Vue is to look at the vue-test-utils guide. So if you go to vue-test-utils.vuejs.org, you will get a really great introduction on how to start testing. And really, this is where you should start if you are beginning. So this vue-test-utils is a part of your app when you start and you create it from scratch. Usually this is a utility, gives you some utility functions that work with Jest, which will be what you use. Typically, you can use Mocha 2 inside your Vue apps to start testing. So if you click Getting Started, you can even clone this repo, the vue-test-utils getting started. And it kind of gives you some examples. The way it works inside vue-test-utils is that you create a file. Well, you don't have to, but you can create a file for each individual component that you're testing, and then inside of that file, you do these describes and you do these its, where basically you're describing what file you're going to test, and then you're doing assertions of what you want to test. And you're doing setup code and then assertions. And the way you do that instead of using vue-test-utils is you use this wrapper. So now mount the component that you have the wrapper. And there's something called mount and then shallow mount. So this mount right here basically mounts the component for you. And it also mounts any child components as well. While shallow mount stubs out all your child components. So that's the difference between this mount right here and shallow mount, and we'll see that more as we move on. And then it kind of gives you an example so once you have this component, you have access to a lot of different things. You have access to the HTML. You also have access to .vm, which is a way you can access the data properties. You can set data. You can do all sorts of things. And then there's the thing called next tick, which is something that they recently became mandatory, and it's necessary when you want to advance the event loop. So if you want it to trigger something and it's not working correctly, you might need to use next tick. I'm not going to get into this too much, but this is just really good to know that sometimes that you have DOM updates that you need to manually trigger the next tick in your tests for it to work correctly. And I like this. It has a section on knowing what to test. I think when you first start jumping into testing, you see, okay, well, I gotta test everything. I gotta do 100% code coverage. I really like this, that it says they don't recommend aiming for complete line-based coverage. So you're never going to have, if you're new to testing, there's something called code coverage where it gauges how many lines of code that you're actually testing. Like, are you testing every single conditional in there? And then some organizations have this 80% code coverage that you have to hit. But what happens is when you have these really high code coverage and you have to keep it at a certain height, you end up creating a lot of brittle tests. It can create a lot of brittle tests, not always, because you're always testing the internal implementation details. So you're always testing, like, what goes into this method? Do I expect this method to return this method? But really what they recommend, and a lot of people, I think this movement for testing is going this way, is instead of testing every single implementation detail, every single method, is that you just assert the component's public interface and treat its internals as a black box. So a good test would be like, make sure that when the component starts, it of course renders, but maybe that if you put some items in a input, that when you click submit, that what you expect happens actually happens. And that might be a better test than testing each individual method inside your component. So keep that in mind. So for example, for the counter component, which increments and displays a counter by 1 each time a button is clicked, its test case would simulate the click and assert that the rendered output is increased to 1. So that's what I see a lot of people testing nowadays instead of doing this really fine-grained testing. Another really good utility to do this type of testing is Cypress. It's more of an end-to-end test runner, and you don't have access. And when you're using Cypress, the whole front end is basically a black box. You can't change any values. You're not going into the methods and setting anything. You're essentially just running through the app from one end to the other and doing different tests to make sure it works. We're not getting into Cypress in this video. I did some excellent Cypress videos in the past. Maybe I'll put some links in the description below if you guys are interested in that. That's another way to do testing. And I know some organizations prefer more the end-to-end tests, and some prefer these more granular unit tests. I think there's a place for both. And as I mentioned before, shallow rendering, and it's essentially where it stubs out any child components of it. And you can do all sorts of things with emitted events, which I'm not going to get into, and slots, and simulating props. So that's the basics of getting started. So let's see if we can get our app, just do a couple of basic tests, and we can see what we can do. Now, if you start an app from scratch, you will, what typically happens is you are going to get the option to add tests. So I'm going to just show you guys real quickly. If I do view create, I know Erik test, and I won't actually create this. Did you mean create? Yeah, I forgot the E. It's going to give you this command line interface to install, to create your basic app right here. It's going to ask you some defaults. So I'm going to manually select features. And one of the options here is unit testing and end-to-end testing. So let's say I select both of those when I'm creating my new Vue app. And I hit enter. Now it's going to ask me what kind of formatter. I'm going to say error prevention only. Hit on save. And here's where it's going to ask you what your unit testing solution is. There's Mocha plus Chai or Jest, and it defaults, if you just hit enter, it would go through Mocha plus Chai. I'm going to show you Jest in this tutorial here, maybe in the future. I think I've done some Vue tutorials for Mocha in the past. I'm sort of leaning towards more Jest nowadays because Jest has some really cool things that Mocha doesn't have with snapshot testing, which I'm not going to get into this video, but it is a possibility. It also has some built-in code coverage stuff that I like. So I think Jest is really powerful, but both of them have similar tooling to get started. So you would click, hit Jest here, press enter, and then it gives you the end-to-end solution. And so Cypress right now is Chrome only, which is one of the things that maybe is a big disadvantage. I think they keep on saying one day it's going to be multiple browsers, and they don't do that. Or you can use Nightwatch, which is WebDriver based. I think in the past there was actually a different end-to-end test runner, and I think they had a Selenium-based one. I think this Nightwatch might be Selenium-based. So essentially, it's a way you can do your end-to-end tests, and you can have, it'll act like it's in multiple different browsers. I really like Cypress. And you just hit Cypress here, and it would go ahead and install everything. I'm not going to do that, of course, because I don't want to do that. So now this app right here, if you've been following along in my previous videos where I created this Firebase app from scratch, and I already installed everything. I actually never installed any tests. So if you look at the folder structure, I have the source folder, but there's no tests here. But I can install that manually. So if I wanted to install this, I could do it two ways. I could do it through Vue UI and then search for the package. Or since I already know what it is, I just go npm install. And once again, if you guys are Yarn fans, have at it. And then you go @vue, and then it's called CLI plugin unit Jest. And I put tac D at the end just to make sure it installs it as a development dependency. Obviously, it's not a normal dependency. So this just take a moment. Okay, so went ahead and installed here. Now, since I installed this, I can actually run a command. I can do vue add unit Jest, and that will get everything I need to start with. If you're running this from Vue UI, it'll sort of do it for you. But since we're not, so let's try that. Vue add unit -jest. And so now that should add everything in here. So there's uncommitted changes to the current repository to commit stash first, still proceed. So I do have some changes, so I guess I should look at those. So I'm just add them all and commit it. Updated. And now I'm going to run the vue add jest. And what this is going to do is going to add everything for the unit jest. It's going to create some directories. It's going to update my package.json file. It's going to do a few things that we need to do to get started. Cool. And see, it says here it added the jest config file. It added an example spec file. It made some changes to my package.json. So that's exactly what I wanted to do, which is good. One other thing, we'll take a look at the changes in a second, but one thing I also want to install is this package called Flush Promises. And this is a recommended package they recommend too. You'll have to install this manually. It doesn't normally come when you install that Vue CLI Jest plugin. This will allow us to flush the promises if we're dealing with asynchronous stuff, which we do in this code base. All right, so we have all the packages installed. So let's take a look what it added. So if we look in our directory structure, now we have this new tests folder and we have an example folder, which nice of them. They created our Hello World app test file. So all it does is it sends in a message, which they call new message, and then they just match it. So they create this wrapper. They do the shallow mount, which once again, that's shallow mounts when you grab a component, but you stub out any child components. You can then have this object that you pass to it, and you can put a bunch of different stuff in this app object. So you can initialize your data object. You can initialize your props. So in this case, we initialize the props with the message, and then we just made sure that the data that was sent through the props matches and it works correctly. So that's what it added there. If you go into the package.json file, you can see here it added in this test unit, which is right here. And what this does is it just runs your test cases. So I'll minimize the hide control bar here. And so let's do it. Let's just do npm run test unit. And you can see here it's running. And it'll pop up something here in a second after it's done running, and it should tell us if our one and only test case, the example hello world, is still working right. Cool. So we can see here that it says hello world, renders props message when passed. It has a little check mark here, and it all works. Now, one thing I like to do when I do tests, I like to keep it running in the background. So I'm going to put -- watch. And this will make it just so it just continually runs. So if I run that and I go back to my terminal and I run test unit. Now what it should do is it will keep this window open here, and it'll just wait for any changes in the file system. And if I want to manually run it, I can type A, and it'll tell us if our tests are working correctly or not. One thing too is this Jest config file. This just has the preset in here from the Vue CLI. Nothing else you really need to do in here. We'll look at this later, maybe in a separate video where we can set up code coverage. So that might be helpful. So here's our one and only one, this example spec file. Let's create a new file and let's test something else. I don't know. Let's start with. So a lot of my components use Firebase, so we're gonna have to look at Firebase to get everything working. So, but let's start with the the top header. So I'm gonna create a new file called top header.spec.js. I think that's the right. Yep, top header. Now it just ran everything again, so I don't have anything in there. Actually, it gave me an error that test suite failed to run. Your test suite must contain at least one test. So let's create one test for top header. So do that. You create a describe, and I'm gonna do top header.vue. And first, I should probably import it in. So I'm gonna import in the top header, which, if I remember correctly, is top header from, and then I can use the @ sign, and I can say it's in the components and top header.vue. So that's where it is. So now this has a function inside here, and now I should be able to inside here to now create the wrapper and mount everything. So let's do that. So let's create a wrapper, and I'm going to create a before each. And what this does, this will run every time before the test runs. And I'm going to, with this wrapper here, I'm going to do a shallow mount. And so we'll need to import in shallow mount. And that's going to be from the test-utils, which, if I remember correctly, that's from @vue-test-utils. Okay, cool. And so now I'll be able to mount it correctly. So to mount this, I do shallow mount, and then the top header, which I just imported. And this is now, if you look at the documentations for vue-test-utils, here's the guide. You can look at the API, and you can look at shallow mount, and you can see here it has some stuff you can go with. So mount has some options. Let's see here. I think there's some mounting options. Yeah, so you can use this with mount and shallow mount. So you have context slots, scope slots, stubs, mocks. If we go back into here and we look at top header, so we go to components top header, you can see it's a pretty simple thing. This is the top header here. This logged in, no, and it has a sign out button. And it uses Firebase. And all it does, as soon as the app loads, it runs this created right here, and it has a sign out button. So with the created, all this does is it checks to see if the user is logged in or not and sets a variable for it. So what I want to do is I just want to see if this will create correctly. But I want to do a little bit of refactoring here because I haven't found a way inside using vue-test-utils to mock lifecycle hooks, but you can mock methods. So one thing I want to do first is I want to take this whole thing here. I'm going to grab it, and I'm going to throw it inside a method called, I don't know, setup Firebase. And it's going to do the same thing it did before, but this time I just want it to be out of the way. And instead of calling it from the, I'll call it from the created right here. So I'll do this dot setup Firebase. Firebase, like that. And that'll make sure, and I'll make this look better, that it runs correctly. So now we have this top header here, and we can do something like this. We can do methods, and I can do setup Firebase, and basically I'm mocking this out so it doesn't run the method. Otherwise, I'm going to have to do a few things. So this before each will run before it starts there, and now I can create. I can try to test something. So I'm going to say it renders. So let's see if I can get this to render or not. And this render function should be just really simple. All it's going to do is make sure that it exists. So I'm going to do wrapper. And, well, let's do this. I'll do expect. Add a expect. And then the expect should have the wrapper in there, and I'm just gonna do exists, and that should too be true. So let's see what our test did here. So I'm looking at the run here. It said 2 passed, so I can hit it again. Yep, everything passed as I expected, which is good. I can do W to show all, run all tests. Yep. So looks like everything's passing in those 2 tests. Cool. So now we know that it renders, but if I took out this methods for setup Firebase, it's going to give me a big old error when it tries to run. Yeah, you can see here, this wrapper exists because it gives me this big node modules error because it tries to run this Firebase auth and it can't do it. Okay. So we have at least the beginnings of testing the top, let me delete this, the beginnings of testing the top header. But what happens if we want to check to see if a user's logged in? So if you look back in this top header, we have this, this on-auth change, and if it passes, this user gets passed, and then this dot logged in equals, if the user object exists, that's a double bang here, then it's true. Otherwise, it'll be false. So we don't want to test. We don't want to like get into the nitty-gritty details of the setup Firebase, but maybe we can mock the Firebase here in such a way that we can go in and do some really basic testing to see if this logged in user comes out true, if this user object comes out true. So this goes a little bit against what I just said earlier about not trying to test the implementation details, but I think this is important because if you can test, Firebase is so popular, you're probably not going to be swapping out Firebase very often. That would be a major rewrite if you went from Firebase to completely something else. And we are going to just test what happens when Firebase returns true and that everything works correctly. So, and that the logged in is set to true. And if we look here at the top header, if it's logged in, this should say yes here in this span. So we could check to make sure it says yes here. So to do that, really we need to mock Firebase. Now this is getting into a little bit more advanced stuff. Well, let's say first, we can create another test here. We just want to see, before I jump into something that complicated, I want to see if this div, let's say this logged in here exists. So we can do something like, and really this should be, let's say it's an H1. I'm going to do some code changes here just because typically you wouldn't just have a logged in just floating right there without, some kind of styling on it. Does H1 exist? And to do that, because I want to show you another property of wrapper, we'll have our callback, or I'll have our function here. And then we can do wrapper. We can do expect again, and we'll have a wrapper. And by the way, this is just a part of the, this is how you expect things. You're always trying to set up your tests and then seeing if they work. So if we do wrapper.find, find can actually grab any sort of selector inside your app, inside your component. So it's just like a CSS selector. I can grab the h1 tag, I can grab classes or whatever I want, and then I can do stuff with it. So if I want to grab the h1 tag, which it's right there, I can say wrapper.find.h1, and then I can be 2b, and then I can put, some text in here. So let's see if this works. So if I just put logged in. And make sure I comment. I'm going to get back to Firebase here so I don't get any weird errors there. Okay, so it failed, but it says object is equality. So it received an object back from wrapper.findh1. So I think you can do wrapper.h1 find. I think it's text, maybe? Let's see. Cool, so now it passed. So now it doesn't have any errors there. So now we grab the text from h1 and we check to see if it's logged in. If I put in something wrong, like logged in 1, it's going to fail because it should be just logged in. So we know to do that. So that's going to be some good tests. If there was a button here, like the sign out, we have a sign out button. We can always we can look for the button and use a trigger and then put in the event name to actually trigger this event too. So sign out is another thing where we do the sign out, and if it doesn't fail, it automatically sets this user. But let's try another test here. I told you about Firebase and how it's kind of a pain, but we can mock out some of Firebase. And so I'll show you how to do that. So to do that, we can do Jest, and then let me make sure my autocomplete doesn't import something it shouldn't. Jest, and then it's doing mock. And then if I look here at the top header, there's this Firebase app. And so you mock it like this with Firebase app. And then I can put an implementation that I want in here. So we have this auth. And that's going to return an object. And right now, all we care about is we want to mock this onAuth changed, onAuth state changed. So let's do that. So we'll do onAuth state changed, and that has a function in it. There's a function passed into it, and then we return the function with true. And so that's how I just quickly mocked this out. So this is a function. You can see here on auth change, it has a function inside here, and then it returns a value, and if that user is true or false, depends if the user is logged in or not. So I'm just going to make it true. So now we can, since that's true there, we should be able to go back into our top header and see if this logged in is true or not. So let's take a look at that. Let me scroll down. So let's see here. I'm going to say user is logged in after setting Firebase mock. Okay. Now, so we're going to expect. Now we're going to use the wrapper. Now the wrapper also has, if we go back to the documentation, see you have this. This is how you do all the mounts. But if you look at, I believe, wrapper, there's the property wrappers. There is a whole bunch of things. Here's wrapper. There's a whole bunch of things it has. And one of the main properties is VM, and VM is the Vue instance itself. And so there's tons of instances on the Vue instance itself, like $data, $props, $el. So you can really use that to your advantage, because now I can do wrapper.vm, I can do $data to get the data that's in the object, and I can get logged in. So if we go back to top header, we see we do have this data. We have this logged in, and this should change to true. So now we have logged in here. Now I can say to be true. So if I do this and just save it, it fails because user logged in after setting Firebase mock, it's coming back as false. And the reason is that because we're just mocking it out right here and it's not doing anything to set up Firebase. So I'm going to comment this out. So hopefully it should use our just mock right here. I'm going to close this. So let's see what happens. Okay, it's running. Oh, cool. All 4 passed, so we don't have any errors. Nice. So now, just to make sure I did the mock correctly, if I put this to false, it should return false, and this should fail. Cool. So it received false. It expected true, but received false. So perfect. So yeah, so we put it to true here, but since we set the mock-up to return this false, when this runs, this comes back as false, and this logged in comes back as false. So cool. So that works there. I don't know. What else could we test in this? We could test clicking the sign out button to see if the sign out app states this replace, and that we're going to this correct login page right here. So what we can do to do that is, let's try it. So first we want to mock the router. And so to do that, you can actually do that through here. So if you go back, there's in shallow mount, there is a couple of, let me look it up here. Yep, it's mocks. And then you can put the mock for router. And so these are only mocks for internal $ values that are on the Vue instance. That's where you put these mocks, like router. And since we haven't set up router yet, we can do const right here, const router, and this would equal the router that we want here. So we can just do replace and function here. And now the router is being replaced there with this router, and all our tests are still passing. There's no issue here. As you can see, yep, still passing. So now we could do check to see on sign out, move to route to correct place, route to correct place. So first we need to do is use the wrapper function. We need to find the button, which is right here, and then click it. So we can do find button, and then we use this trigger, and we send a click event, and that will click the button for us. The next thing we need to do is make sure that once we do that, it'll trigger this sign out. And it's going to do this Firebase auth sign out. So we're going to have to mock the sign out as well. But we could do that pretty easily. So we have this on auth state changed. We can add in a sign out. And that's actually going to return a promise. And we're going to resolve it. So now the promise resolve will be resolved. So now that's mocked out. And let's see here, our tests ran, and yep, I don't see any errors yet, so that's good. We don't really have anything. So it triggered the click, but it didn't really do anything after it triggered the click. So now we need to see if it works. So one thing I like to do sometimes is there's a console log data here already in my app, so I'm gonna just put in a second parameter here, test. And I'm going to look at my test to see, do I see, okay, test undefined. So we know that this came back correctly and that our router, that everything looks okay here. So it came back as test undefined. So we know it ran correctly and didn't give any errors. So now what we can do is we can see if what happened here. So if we can expect, and we can expect the router. So we have this router here, and it's replace. And really, this is a mock that we can check to see if it's been called. So one thing you can do is mock, and I think it's calls. Let me check here what the right one is. So what we want to do here is not using mock.calls, but I can do router replace, and I can do last called with, and I can give it the object that was called. So it should have been called with this name login. So I'm going to put name here, and right here, this login. So let me put something wrong first and see if it works. So it's testing. Okay, it says it said it failed. Expected name login 1, but number of calls 0. So it doesn't look like it thinks it was called at all. So this is where we could try doing the flush promises. So there is a flush promises that we imported in. And so this will help us actually flush the promises out. Otherwise, it thinks that it didn't finish. So here's flush promise. Let me see if I can spell this. M-I-S-E-S. I think that's right. And it's flush promises. So now up right here, right after I do this trigger, I'm going to just call flush promises and see if that fixes it. Okay. So it says number of calls 0. So still doesn't think it was called. Oops, I found my error here. And actually what I need to do is make this async function. And this flush promises, I need to wait on it. And if I do that, then everything passed. But if I change this to login 1 and I save it, it fails because it expects name login. So there we go, change it back to login. And it passes again. Cool, so I think this is a lot of information to digest. I think I'm gonna stop the video here. So in the next video, I'm gonna go in and test a few more things in my app, a few more mocks for some of the other. I'm going to create another Firebase app mock for the register and login components and show you guys how you can test that. And if you guys have any questions, make sure you leave a comment below. But I think this is pretty neat. All you can stuff. You can do this with the shallow amount and the different expects and tests you can do. And this flush promises makes things a lot easier when you're doing with asynchronous code and you need to make sure that things finish before you start testing them. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Thanks.